Our scripture reading this morning comes from Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 48. It's a text that may sound familiar to you. Tom actually preached on this text back in November, but it shows up here in our lectionary, and I was pleased to have an opportunity to reflect on it as well. This is Jesus speaking. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also a 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your God in heaven. God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than anyone else? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect. Seek perfection, therefore, as your God in heaven is perfect. May these words be to us our light and our life. Thanks be to God. I was the youngest of 8 cousins, and we were each about a year apart from each other, so when we got together at holidays, there was always somebody to play with. We spent most of our holidays together as we were growing up, and there was a lot of teasing that went on among these cousins. And I, as the youngest, often at the short end of things, especially by my 2 male older cousins. You know, like just walking by me and just pushing me as hard as they could until I fell to the floor. And then they would laugh and point and say, wimp. I looked up to them because they both played sports, baseball and hockey. And I always assumed that they were pretty good. And even though I was pretty athletic as a kid, every time that I would play sports with my cousins, they would try to humiliate me, throwing the ball over my head to make me run for it, or using their size advantage to keep things away from me. Always, their message seemed to be the same. You'll never be as good as us. I didn't really know how to fight back, so most of the time I just chose to play with my girl cousins instead. Even though I was interested in sports as a child, though, I was really too afraid to go out for sports. And I think back on that now, and I think that some of it may be that I was afraid that all the other boys in sports would be like my cousins. Or, maybe even worse, I believed what they said about me. Put-downs are something perhaps all of us have had to endure in our lives. Some of them are easily dismissed, but others make a deep impression. Some strike us so deeply that we internalize them, and they begin to be part of a mantra of self-criticism or self-judgment. I think we can agree all of us have picked up negative messages along the way, on the playground, in our families, and from our culture. Messages that say we aren't good enough, we don't measure up, we don't fit in. And too often, we believe them. Believing them takes away our confidence and leads us to hide who we really are from the world. Think about it. The more that we feel we don't fit in, the more we tend to hide. Listen to this story of Alice, who struggled growing up as a boy. She writes, "I hated puberty and the changes it brought. I used whatever I could to resist it. Every day I hated myself and my body more and more. I had nobody I could talk to, and it was easy to make the wrong choice. I started starving myself to slow down the impact of puberty and give me control of my body. In college, I conceded ground to my gender identity. I grew my hair long, I plucked my facial hair, and at night, in secret, I would cross-dress. On this particular Friday, I washed my hair and shaved and plucked my body and facial hair, which had grown since that morning. I dressed as a female, trying to look halfway presentable and not a man in drag. It had become harder these days, and I knew soon I wouldn't be able to do this anymore. I waited patiently that night in my room for my mom to go to bed. And when I heard her go to her room, I opened my window, dropped down onto an outcropping before jumping into my garden and skittering off into the night. I didn't actually do much. I just went to the park, wandering about in the dead of night. A few people walked by me, but I dared not say anything. Even if they had spoken to me, my voice wasn't even remotely passable. When I returned home, I entered through the back door and as silently as I could ran upstairs. I closed my door, undressed, and went to bed. The next morning, I got dressed in my male clothes and went downstairs. "Good morning," I chirped. My mom just grunted, which was unusual because I had such a good relationship with her. And then she approached me with an angry look on her face and said, "What were you doing last night?" Shock and fear swept over my face. "Excuse me?" I replied as calmly as I could. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't know what's going on under my own roof?" Her voice rose with her anger. Then my fear got complemented with guilt. "Mom, While I wrestled with the truth, she finished my confession for me. "Yes, I know, you've been sneaking girls in here at night. It's disgusting." "What? No, that's not true. I would never allow a stranger into the house," I protested. Taken aback, she glared at me. I assured her, giving her my word, I was mortified at such an accusation. My mom explained that she'd been in the living room with the lights out when she had heard the back door open. She thought it was a burglar, and she'd nervously investigated, but to her surprise, she caught a glance of a dainty teenage girl who, rather than steal anything, silently had crept up to my bedroom. Still doubtful of my claim, she let the matter drop. Then she laughed, but she swore she'd kick me out if I was lying to her. I sighed, heavy with relief. But that evening, I threw away my female clothes, crying and tearful. I couldn't risk her finding out what really had happened. It would be a long time before I would express myself as female again. Our external experiences of rejection can get internalized and explode into self-destructive behavior. Often our bodies are the battlefield. Substance abuse, eating disorders, and self-mutilation might first come to mind, but think also of the billions of dollars we spend trying to measure up to society's standards of beauty. And then our internal judgments also get projected out onto other people. I saw a Facebook post recently that said, "What's up with these Olympic athletes all also being supermodels?" There was a subtle message underneath this post, something like, "They've got it all, and what do I have?" Television feeds our self-loathing. It feasts on the extraordinary, making our ordinary lives seem unimportant. And I don't know if this is true for you, but as silly as it sounds, I find myself watching these Olympic athletes. And on the one hand, I'm so impressed. I'm amazed at what they can do, clearly beyond anything I could imagine or attempt. And yet at the same time, I'm somehow comparing myself to them, to their level of confidence, to their ability to focus, to their level of skill. While we watch as they try to impress the Olympic judges, we struggle to satisfy our own inner judge. Sherry Huber, who's founder and resident teacher at the Zen Monastery Peace Center in California, wrote a book called "There's Nothing Wrong with You." She writes, "If you had a person in your life treating you the way you treat yourself, you would have gotten rid of them long ago." Some have found it helpful to personify these judgmental voices. It's been called the inner critic, the judge, the editor, and the censor. And if you look at the level of attacks sometimes we endure, would it be a stretch to say it feels like an inner enemy? Now, some of you may remember that Tom preached a great sermon on the enemy language on this very text back in November. No doubt there's a connection between our inner and outer struggle. Whatever you call it, the struggle within is one of the most difficult parts of our journeys. Now, to be sure, Jesus was not talking about our inner enemy when he told his disciples to love their enemies. He was talking about healing our relationships with people who stand across from us, people who threaten us. But what would it mean to love your inner judge? What would it take to respond to the voices of judgment and self-loathing within us with love? Jesus said, "I say to you, love your enemy. Pray for those that persecute you." How might this change our inner conversation to include more love and compassion? Perhaps it begins with remembering that we are made in God's image. We heard the passage from Genesis at the top of the service. We might not believe in the 7-day creation story, but can we accept that there is a divine imprint on each of us? Can we imagine that underneath all this negative self-talk is not only a beloved child of God, but a shimmering reflection of the divine itself? How can we live more and more into this truth? How can we bring it to the surface? Jesus suggests the path begins with love. Indeed, how can we embody that love? A love your enemy kind of love for ourselves. How would self-love then also change our ability to love one another? I haven't yet read Bill Plotkin's book, Soulcraft, but a good friend of mine has been studying with Bill and shared with me how he reframes this notion of the inner critic or the inner enemy. And I think it resonates with Jesus' call and may offer us a first step. He begins by suggesting we change the archetype from inner critic or inner enemy, whatever you might choose, change it to the loyal soldier. According to Plotkin, the loyal soldier, quote, is a courageous, wise, and stubborn subpersonality that formed during our childhood and created a variety of strategies to help us survive the realities, often dysfunctional, of our families and cultures. It keeps us safe by making us small or limited, or by further traumatizing us, shoveling chunks of our wholeness into our shadow, so that we will appear acceptable or invisible to the powers that be. The loyal soldier. There's a lot to unpack in this, but my friend says the key insight is this. Rather than imagining your inner judgments coming from an enemy that is out to get you, you imagine them coming from a loyal soldier who is trying its best to protect you. The more you can develop this image of the loyal soldier, the more options you begin to have to redirect its efforts. Listen, think about it. For soldiers, orders change. Missions are completed. Tours of duty end, and eventually the war is over, and they return home to find a new job during peacetime. Learning to love your loyal soldier invites you to relate to it in new ways, to draw strength from it, and redirect its energy towards preserving inner peace. Now, I, like probably many of us in this room, still struggle with my inner critic. And yet, I can no longer see it as an enemy to be defeated. Instead, it's becoming something else, something more like a brother that I must welcome home, or a child that needs to be reparented. And while we strive to welcome home all the parts of ourselves, aren't we likely to be more able to love one another? Now, eventually I found peace with my cousins. Maybe it was because eventually I ended up being 5 inches taller than all of them. Or maybe it was going off to college that changed them somehow. Or maybe it was the death of our grandfather, and suddenly this new feeling of family being so much more important. Whatever it was, we began to see each other differently. We began to see beyond our childhood roles and start to see the real person underneath. We found something to like, something to love about each other. And in those revelations, we began to heal. Amen.